by now. I am the director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies. And it is a pleasure to welcome not only all the audience, which I have already done, but Professor Franklin Knight, who is this year's Lewis Memorial keynote speaker. Also a good and old friend, Professor Anthony Mengo from Florida International, retired, who will be commenting the presentation of Dr. Knight. David Lewis, I want to welcome you as well on behalf of the family, and I want to thank you for the support, not only to this activity, but to the Institute in general. I want to welcome our Chancellor, Luis Ferrao, who is working hard and he has been patient, very much so. An extra thanks for our Chancellor. Our thank you and welcome to Angelica Varela, Dr. Angelica Varela, the Dean of Social Sciences, and of course, Jorge Giovanetti, who will be presenting the speakers today. The Gordon K. and Sybil Lewis Memorial Lecture was initiated as an annual event in 2014 and was held annually until 2017, when Hurricane Maria disrupted Puerto Rican life as we knew it. We planned to resume the lecture in 2020, but we were again interrupted by the earthquakes and COVID-19. Finally, we were able to, last year we were able to present the 5th annual or the 5th lecture, the memorial lecture. And this year we were able to present the 6th Gordon K. and Sybil Lewis Memorial Lecture on a consecutive year basis, finally, in spite of the economic hardships imposed by the university on the University of Puerto Rico by the Fiscal Control Board and on our campus by the President's budget cuts. The social science faculty, the process now moves, I'm sorry, this is a script that I wrote that it has some errors. But basically what I'm trying to say is that this year, the social science faculty approved unanimously a resolution to name the institute in memory of Dr. Gordon K. and Mrs. Sybil Farrell Lewis. This will now go to the academic senate, and eventually it will be endorsed by our chancellor and go on to the Junta Universitaria, upstairs to the president. The Junta Universitaria gathers all of the chancellors, and then it will go to another junta, the Junta de Gobierno. But within a year, we hope to have this process completed, and next year we hope to have a two-day presentation of the memorial, the Lewis Memorial Lecture. Rather than the lecture, it will be a conference. Dr. and Mrs. Lewis came to Puerto Rico from Wales and Trinidad, respectively. They worked at the University of Puerto Rico since the 1950s. Him as a professor in political science and academic researcher, and she as a research assistant and later editor of Caribbean Studies, the journal published by the Institute since 1961. After graduate studies at Harvard and teaching experiences in the University of Chicago, UCLA, and a summer course at UPR, Professor Gordon K. Lewis was called as a consultant for the drafting of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico Constitution in 1952. He then joined the political science department at the University of Puerto Rico in the 1950s and served as director of the university's Institute of Caribbean Studies from 1983 to 1987. He wrote path-breaking books on the Caribbean's history, politics, and intellectual development, such as Puerto Rico, Freedom and Power in the Caribbean, the growth of the modern West Indies, and main currents in Caribbean thoughts. In my estimation, the growth of the modern West Indies, published in 1968, stands shoulder to shoulder with the contributions of Eric Williams and Juan Bosch, from Columbus to Castro, and the Cristobal Colon a Fidel Castro, published in 1970. And it presents the Caribbean as a fulcrum of change rather than as an exotic colonial paradise shaped by rum, molasses, and syncretic African cultural traditions. Mrs. Sybil Lewis, Farrell Lewis, came to Puerto Rico, came to UPR as a student of chemistry, but worked as a research assistant in the Cooperative Institute, the Social Science Research Center, and the Institute of Caribbean Studies. She joined the Institute of Caribbean Studies in the 1960s as a full-time career research assistant, working with the academic researchers at the Institute and in the production of the Caribbean Studies Journal. After completing studies in the London School of Economics in French and Dutch, as well as publishing in the London Polytechnical School, she became the editor of Caribbean Studies Journal. It has been said to me, and this has been said by many people, that Sybil, as everyone called her affectionately, Mrs. Farrell Lewis, was the ad honorem editor for many of the doctoral dissertations of the Puerto Rican intellectual elite. Many professors, she helped many professors at the University of Puerto Rico with editing their thesis in English. In gratitude to and recognition of their legacy, we dedicate this memorial lecture to them and hope to complete the dedication to their memory of the Institute of Caribbean Studies that they helped to forge into a pan-Caribbean center of intellectual endeavor. I would like to call now on Dr. David Lewis to speak to us on behalf of the family. David.
Sí, gracias, Emilio. Appreciate the remarks and, of course, the work that everyone has done for this year's annual memorial lecture. Estimado Chancellor Luis Ferrao Delgado, Dean Angélica Varela Yabona, Emilio, Director of the Institute, Professor Jorge Giovannetti, and my good friends and mentors, Emeritus Professors Franklin Knight and Tony Mengo, both Caribbean academics and good friends and colleagues of Gordon and Sybil and the family for years. Let me also, on behalf of the family, my siblings, Catherine, Diana, Jonathan, spouses, Maritza, Manuela, Dave, and Jose Miguel, and grandchildren of Gordon and Sybil, Linda, Danilo, Gordon, Ian, Lauren, Barbara, Sybil, and Isabel, give you all special thanks for the 2 decades of work that the Institute and the University and all your team have put together, both for this conference and the Lewis Mintz Caribbean Collection at the University. And now the announcement of the naming of the Institute to honor the career and the work of our parents. We thank you because it's more than just an academic and professional commitment you have made, but also a labor of love. And special thanks also to past director Humberto Garcia Muñiz, who started this initiative over a decade ago, and also to Professor Betsaida Vélez Natal, and retired professors Antonio Diaz-Royo and Juan Giusti. In addition, please allow me the usual speaker latitude to offer some personal in memoriam condolences to our Caribbean Studies nation and friends of Gordon and Sybil, whom we lost in the past 15 months since the February 2021 fifth memorial lecture. Professor Edwin Jones from the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, Ambassador Sir Courtney Blackman from Barbados, Ambassador Christopher Thomas from Trinidad and Tobago, Yesu Persad from Guyana, Sir Gene Holder from Barbados, Professor Selwyn Ryan from the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago, and Ambassador Frederick Imam Sadeh from the Dominican Republic. Rest in peace, friends. I wanted to give some remarks on what I call the Lewises and Caribbean Studies, opportunity and privilege, 2 words which today are quite chastised in our all-knowledgeable cancel culture. And I think it's important because throughout their career and formation 7 decades ago at the university, opportunity and privilege were 2 key issues throughout the development. I myself in my own career have benefited from them. And since I also received partial training at different points in time, both from Marxist-Leninists and Jesuits, you will find I will not shy away from acknowledging and accepting opportunity and privilege and welcome any attempt at cancellation. The University of Puerto Rico of the 1950s, to which Gordon and Sybil landed as professor and student respectively, offered a unique blend of opportunity and privilege in terms of academic excellence, quality and meritocracy, institutional fortitude and functionality, strategic and visionary leadership, and a rich social, cultural, racial, ethnic language mix of Caribbean, Latin American, North American, and European influences. All in all, a unique ecosystem where their professional and personal lives grew, were nurtured, and flourished. By the time Richard Morse, the famous Latin Americanist, founded the Institute in 1958, 65 years next year, which we all hope to celebrate at the campus in Rio Piedras, along with UPR faculty and regional academic young scholars like Anthony Mengo and many others, Gordon and Sybil were on their way to solid and successful careers. But it was the Institute and what followed which set in motion a series of events and camaraderie collaborations beyond into the region and with US and European universities that marked the development in what for some decades now we call Caribbean studies, way before the growth of geographic area studies in US academia. Institutionally, the Institute was a turning point, a before and after in academic work on and in the Caribbean. And this was so despite what a colleague friend from the University of the West Indies, a professor emeritus of history, recently commented to me just this week, that in those years, the University of the West Indies had a sense that study in the Caribbean by Caribbean academics was a somewhat superfluous effort. Tony Mengo and Franklin Knight with us today were real actors of that época, protagonistas, as we say in Spanish, from the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, respectively, as well as students, and they will surely shed more light on this than I can. Both of them broke with the traditional Anglophile Oxbridge academic tradition of the era and expanded into the rest of the Americas and the more diverse Caribbean itself. By the 1970s and 80s, they had both maximized opportunity and privilege by pushing forth Caribbean studies at Johns Hopkins University and at Florida International University, founding and launching major research and academic programs and centers there. Their joining us today as presenter and discussant is indeed a closing of the circle of much of this Lewis generational work on Caribbean studies as an academic discipline and field of work. They are also two of our very few English-speaking Caribbean scholars who are multilingual and have extensive careers and achievements well beyond their English-speaking roots. I think you get the point. Throughout the 60s and 70s, this incipient Caribbean studies effort grew in leaps and bounds, with the Institute and the University of Puerto Rico not only attracting many more colleagues, but also leveraging the Caribbean Studies Network into the US and the region. Morse and Mengo left to Yale, and in 1962, Morse founded the Latin American Studies Association in the living room of his New Haven home with colleagues, thus beginning the institutionalization to come of area studies in the Americas. Mengo later joined FIU in Miami as a small upstart university in the swampish South Florida of the day, and in the past 3+ decades transformed it into the major research university and one of the top institutions today focused on Latin America and the Caribbean. I am reminded that the Caribbean Studies Association was born in San Juan in 1974, and in 1976 in London, the Society for Caribbean Studies, the two academic organizational stalwarts of Caribbean studies today. Both will celebrate Golden Jubilees in the next 2 and 4 years, respectively. The Caribbean Studies Journal grew into the #1 peer-reviewed academic journal on the region, crossing all disciplines, and Sybil dedicated almost a quarter of a century of her work to that 6th Lewis child. Gordon, of course, was prolific to the maximum, and since 1963 and 1968, chalked up the first 2 classics on the region, Puerto Rico, Freedom and Power in the Caribbean, and Growth of the Modern West Indies, both reissued in 2004 by Ian Randall Publishers, with wonderful introductions by Tony Mengo and Franklin Knight, respectively. So by the time the 1980s came around, we had full-blown area studies, not only on Latin America, but even the island-specific ones, We have a Puerto Rican Studies Association, a Cuban Studies Association, and more recently, Dominican Studies and Haitian Studies Association. Yet curiously, it was not until 1981 that Gordon himself actually penned the substantive and continued thought and work on the notion of Caribbean studies, what it meant, what it was, its role in academia, and also in the region's political and social development. His May 1981 Caribbean Studies Association keynote address in St. Thomas, US Virgin Islands, laid the key groundwork in a short, analytical, and perspective 12-paper presentation, The Possibilities of Change and Transformation in the Caribbean during the 1980s, later to be followed by the short working paper in 1983, The Making of a Caribbeanist, and then the 1984 classic, Main Currents in Caribbean Thought, The Historical Evolution of Caribbean Society in its Ideological Aspects, 1492 to 1900. All this work over the decades was clearly marked by the benefits of opportunity and privilege of the era in terms of societies, individuals, and institutions in Puerto Rico, across the Caribbean, the US, and Europe. All this work marked by a vision and practice of a distinct Caribbean intellectual pluralism writ large, academic and political, identity pluralism, geographic and linguistic pluralism, and of course, racial and ethnic pluralism. It was marked and was a radical break from the traditional imperial, colonial, sub-regional structures across governments and societies, language groupings, as well as academic disciplines. All those traditional set Caribbean mores and structures, Gordon and Sybil systematically broke and sought to change, beginning, of course, with their own interracial and multicultural marriage and family life. Theirs was indeed an early understanding of the much misused and maligned term, greater or wider Caribbean. In my own education and upbringing, this was impressed on me at home, of course, but also outside the home. I was privileged to have George Lamin teach me a course on Caribbean literature at Brandeis in 1982. And in typical Lamin fashion, he would state, "What is this West Indies we say we are? West of what? Indies, where you say we are." And a full decade later, my colleague and friend from the Dominican Republic, Miguel Seara Hatton, the 2019 Lewis Memorial Lecturer, at a 1991 Association of Caribbean Economists meeting in Barbados, stated, "Can we not see and experience that there are many more people in the Caribbean who do not speak English as a first language, are not Black, but are mulattoes and mestizos, and do not play cricket? There are actually many more Cubans and Dominicans and Haitian in each island than in the entire English-speaking Caribbean. And the economic fortitude of the non-independent islands, American, British, Dutch, and French, outnumber by 50-fold that of the sovereign CARICOM islands, even with the recent oil and gas largesse of the hitherto poor backyard of Guyana. Geography matters, I was taught, but I think numbers also matters, as we have learned." All this was embedded in the work and efforts launched some 6 decades ago at the University of Puerto Rico with the Institute of Caribbean Studies. And to a varying degree and with many adjustments and changes, it remains. Despite recent natural and human-made disasters seeking to subvert and undermine the effort, it still moves. So again, as a family, we thank you for continuing the movement. We thank you for honoring our parents and their life and work with you. And we urge you to ensure that these 65 years of quality work and success, bound together by opportunity and privilege, lead to more work and success, are nurtured and supported today as they were then, and that together we join efforts and resources to ensure the institutional stability and permanence of the work of Caribbean studies at the Institute and the University of Puerto Rico. Last but not least, let me remind you all that with this 6th Lewis Memorial Lecture, we have also launched the Lewis Memorial Fund and the GoFundMe account that Emilio just notified you of. The fund will provide a resource endowment for the annual Lewis Lecture and the work of the Institute related to the lecture, as well as to the Institute's Caribbean archives, which now house the Lewis Collection and the Sydney Mintz collection of books and documents. So please contribute as best you can, and let's continue this effort. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, David. I have to make a little bit of a shift now because Dr. Luis Ferrao has further commitments, our Chancellor. So without any further ado, I leave you Dr. Luis Ferrao, Chancellor of the Rio Piedras campus of the University of Puerto Rico. Luis.
Thank you, Emilio. Good afternoon to all. Good afternoon to everyone. Buenas tardes. Very happy to be here with such a distinguished group of professors, researchers, and specialists in Caribbean studies. The University of Puerto Rico prides itself as being the center of the Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, correctly led by Emilio Pantojas, and I acknowledge Mr. Franklin Knight as the keynote speaker today. I also want to acknowledge Dean Angelica Varela and Dr. David Lewis, son of Gordon Sibyl. I congratulate and commend Dr. Pantojas for preparing this activity. Regretfully, I cannot stay for the presentation. I would love to, but previous commitments required my presence. So I'm glad to say that for the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus, it's more than a privilege to be here and to be hosting through Zoom, obviously, in these times of pandemia, this important activity. So I'd like to excuse myself and very grateful for the invitation. Thank you all, and I hope the activity is a very memorial one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferrao, Chancellor. Goodbye. And we now would like the Dean of the Social Science Faculty, Dr. Angelica Varela Yabona, to welcome us on behalf of the faculty. Dr. Varela.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pantojas. It's a pleasure. Good afternoon and very welcome to the great faculty of the social sciences. So we are here on behalf of all of us here at the faculty. We salute Professor Knight, Professor Maingo, Chancellor Ferrao, who just you heard about him, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Pantojas, Dr. Giovannetti, and our distinguished guests and scholars in this time of the afternoon. It is a great pleasure to welcome on behalf, as I said to you before, of the great Faculty of Social Sciences. And this year, the Social Science Faculty approved, as Dr. Pantojas told us before, in a fashion unanimously to name the Institute of the Caribbean Studies in honor of Dr. Gordon K. Lewis and Mrs. Sybil Farrell Lewis. That's spectacular. We will work steadfastly to ensure that the process is completed in time for next year. In next year's lecture, which is planned as a 2-day conference in honor of these highly regarded and well-remembered colleagues. Through generations, it has been kind of a myth in terms of both Dr. Lewis and Mrs. Farrell Lewis. It's our living inheritance here at the university, at the Rio Piedras campus, of course, and at the faculty. Dr. Gordon Lewis is among the founders of Caribbean Studies as a field of intellectual endeavor, and Mrs. Sybil Farrell Lewis worked, as told before, with great dedication to make the Caribbean Studies Journal a leading publication in human sciences and cultural studies. It is, and we are proud of it, it is the only regional journal that includes articles in Spanish, English, and French. For the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Institute of Caribbean Studies represents the organic connection of the University of Puerto Rico to our Caribbean region. In the House of the Institutes and of the Social Science Faculty, we have been privileged to host scholars of the statures of Hermanus Ulrich, Thomas Matthews, Royce Bryce Laporte, Donald Hawk, and indeed, Dr. Franklin W. Knight and Dr. Anthony Mengo. The Institute has also been graced with the intellectual mentorship of scholars of the stature of Dr. Eric Williams and Dr. Sidney Means. To me, as always, I have been here in this position almost 4 years, 3 years, something like that. For me, the Institute and I think for me and for my fellow professors, to be the Institute of Caribbean Studies, or the Instituto del Caribe, as we call it in Spanish, is the jewel of the crown of the Rio Piedras campus, not of the faculty, of the Rio Piedras campus. This, although Dr. Pantojas constantly tells me not to say this aloud, is a thing that comes out of words. Its distinguished history, its faculty, the 15 years of the Caribbean Lectures series, and of course, the trilingual journal and global projection attest to that. Of course, in this time, we have the leadership, great leadership of Dr. Pantojas and Dr. Giovanetti at the archive, two Puerto Rican scholars. Well, we are very proud of them. And I think that their work shows it. It's not my saying, it's the work they have been doing for the greatness of the faculty and of course, of the University of Puerto Rico. We are very happy, of course, to welcome you to the 6th Louis Memorial Lecture. I hope that you enjoy it very much. And I think that we are going to have a very great intellectual experience. Thank you to Dr. Knight and Dr. Mangoy for accepting our invitation and sharing with us your knowledge. Thank you, and we will be seeing you very, very soon. And I think that we are going to recall all the great things that we are going to accomplish in the coming years. Thank you so much, and let's hear the important things you're going to enrich our learning experience. Thank you so much, and welcome very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Varela Yabona. And now I will call on my colleague and friend and former student, actually. That was a long, long time ago. But the good thing about professors, and you all know this, is that we share with students that eventually become not only our colleagues, but become better scholars than we are. And such is the case of my friend and colleague, Jorge Giovanetti, whom I have asked to present both of you today. Dr. Giovanetti, please.
Thanks, Emilio, and thanks, everyone. Welcome, all the people in the conference today. Our speaker today, Dr. Franklin W. Knight, is Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University, an institution he joined in 1973. He was appointed the Leonard and Helen R. Stallman Professor of History in 1991, and in 2014, he entered the emeritus status. He co-chairs the Johns Hopkins Academy of Scholars. Knight's research interests focus on social, political, and cultural aspects of Latin America and the Caribbean, especially after the 18th century, as well as on the American slave systems in their comparative dimensions. Professor Knight has lectured widely across the world and has visited almost every country in the Western Hemisphere. Professor Knight started his career researching Cuban history and has consistently visited the Cuban archipelago over more than 70 trips. He has conducted research as well as led study group tours across the Caribbean and in Latin America, Portugal, and Spain. His publications include 13 books and 108 articles in major scholarly journals. My generation of students of Cuba and the Caribbean began our training reading his classic Slave Society in Cuba during the 19th century, as well as his The Caribbean, the Genesis of a Fragmented Nationalism, from the series of Latin American histories in Oxford University Press. For 14 years, Professor Knight wrote a fortnightly article for the Jamaican Observer. His Latin American, the Caribbean problems have been aired in different media across the world, as well as local programs on commercial and local public radio and television stations across the United States. He served as academic consultant and appeared in 7 public television documentaries. My 2 cents from me on a more personal note, Professor Knight is characterized for his insightful and sharp interpretations, as well as his encyclopedic knowledge of Caribbean societies. First, in 1985, he published a short yet insightful piece on Jamaican migrants to Cuba, perhaps one of the first articles on this topic. His insights inspired my work and that of others who examined this topic in recent years. Second, his interventions in conferences, seminars, and symposia were always characterized by his knowledge of intricate details of, dare I say, metadata about Caribbean demographics, population, and processes. This often led many attendees in awe and cemented the admiration of generations of scholars. Commenting Professor Knight today, we are delighted to have a member of the Institute of Caribbean Studies family, Professor Anthony Penn Mengo. Professor Mengo is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Florida International University, is a former president of the Caribbean Studies Association, and author of numerous works. He is the author of The United States and the Caribbean, Challenges of an Asymmetrical Relationship, in many editions and published in Spanish as well, and dozens of articles, and more recently, the book Sons of the Soil, about the Mengo family and the French Creoles in Trinidad history. Now, it is a pleasure to present to you Professor Franklin Knight. Thank you.
Franklin, thank you very much for accepting to be this year's keynote speaker. And without any further ado, the floor and the camera and the microphone are yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? I thought I was on.
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Well, I don't seem to be able to pull up my PowerPoint, but it says it's playing, but let me go on and see if I can share the screen. I'm not getting. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, particularly you, Emilio, for inviting me to give the 6th Gordon K. Lewis lecture. And also, of course, I want to thank the really nice introduction of Professor Giovannetti. I don't know why he was so kind. Young people are not usually kind to old emeritus professors because their work usually supersedes theirs in all sorts of ways that sometimes we admire a lot. You hear me but not see me, is that it? Can you hear me now?
Yes,
no,
we can see you and hear you. Both.
Okay, if you can see me, I will just go on then with the lecture. And then we will do something about the contents. Maybe after listening, you don't want to have the visuals. So I wanted to say that you have heard or at least deduced, and in any case, I am no better at the biography of Gordon Lewis than someone like Tony Mengo, who is here. But it's important to me in my evaluation of the contribution, the intellectual contribution that Gordon K. Lewis made to Caribbean studies, and important to point out, as you've heard before, that he started the concept of Caribbean studies before it became formally accepted in the Caribbean. But I go back always, and I have written this about Gordon Lewis, that I think it's important to recognize that his being from Wales and the son of teachers, and the age in which he developed, he came to adulthood, that is the background of the Irish question, the Great Depression, and World War II, are important factors in Gordon Lewis's intellectual expansion as he came to the University of Puerto Rico in the 1950s. Wales and the Caribbean were both frontier British communities that had become economic dependence, that had developed economic dependency on a single product. In the case of Wales, it was coal. In the case of the Caribbean, it was sugar. And both had restless worker populations in the earlier part of the 20th century. So that the Great Depression, which reconstituted global economies, had a great impact on both Wales and the Caribbean. And both suffered from their marginality in the structure of the British Empire. The region was fragmented. It had been fragmented long before Lewis arrived. It had been fragmented for centuries. But although fragmented, these fragments, as I have written elsewhere, had much in common. There were larger islands and small islands, and even parts of the mainland were considered integral to the Caribbean community when it's considered in its historical context. Some islands were politically independent by the beginning of the 20th century. Cuba was, Haiti was, second largest, most important independent country in the Western Hemisphere. And some islands had experienced what has generally been considered in the literature as the sugar revolutions between 1650 and 1900, while others had not. Of course, Caribbean studies, when it became a field, did not look at these aspects of the Caribbean. What it tried to do at the beginning, except for the emphasis that Lewis provided, was to see the Caribbean as marginal to what was happening outside the Caribbean. And I think that if we follow Lewis's example and his prodigious publications, which of course, as you have heard, started in 1963 and continued well into the 1980s, what emerges from these is a sensibility that the Caribbean needed to be centered within our considerations of history, no matter from which perspective we wrote that history. This is not the time, nor is this the place, I think, at the moment, for me to go into the thoughts behind Gordon Lewis's writing. But I want to recommend to you books, not the only one, but the best one was the 2015 publication by Brian Meeks and Germaine McAlpin, which they call Freedom, Power, and Sovereignty, the Thought of Gordon Lewis. And in this publication, we can distill some of what I will call the Lewis wisdom. And there are 5 points I would like to make. The first is, of course, that Lewis attributed agency to the common individual in the construction, the wider construction of Caribbean culture and society. That it was not a top-down operation. It was, in fact, an integrated, reciprocal work by all factors in the society. This is commonplace today, but in the 50s and 60s, this was novelty. That his publications reflected prodigious research and reading, but also a deep familiarity with the people, the places, and the circumstances of the Caribbean, so that there was an inherent dynamism in the thought and writing of Lewis that I captured, and certainly other serious writers and scholars of the Caribbean captured as well. The third is that Lewis saw imperialism and colonialism as the bane of the Caribbean existence. He was basically anti-imperialist, and as I've written sometimes, he tended sometimes to lose the forest for the trees because of this focus that he had in this aspect of it. But nevertheless, he was an internationalist and deplored any form of hegemony. And throughout the writings, you can see this resistance to hegemony or hegemonial constructs everywhere. And finally, I would say that he was one of the earliest to include the smaller Leeward and Windward Islands in his general histories of the Caribbean. So overall, the impact of his work was to put time, place, and circumstances in the center of in understanding the genesis of Caribbean societies and histories. And if you look at it that way, then the Caribbean radiates out to Africa, to Europe, to North America, to Latin America, and to Asia. But it is not the margin of any of those. And if you begin to see the Caribbean as the center, then you begin to undermine these general popular but misleading concepts such as triangular trades or even the slave trades as the singular dependent sponsoring position of the Caribbean. When I think of the Caribbean, I always think of a quotation from the Abbé Raynal, from his philosophical and political history of the settlements and trades of the Europeans in the East and the West Indies, which was first published in the 1770s, 1774, but in English in 1798. And if you remember, he began that 6-volume publication by saying, "No event has been so interesting to mankind in general, and to the inhabitants of Europe in particular, as the discovery of the New World and the passage to India by the Cape of Good Hope. It gave rise to a revolution in commerce and the power of nations, as well as in the manners, industry, and government of the whole world. The productions of climates situated under the equator were consumed in countries bordering on the pole. The industry of the north was transplanted to the south, and the inhabitants of the west were clothed with the manufactures of the east. A general intercourse of opinions, laws, customs, diseases, and remedies, virtues and vices was established among men." Now, if you look at the Caribbean and you consider what Raynal said, then you can begin to understand, as I think should be understood in Caribbean studies, that the Caribbean was important, extremely important in global history after 1492. And in fact, it was an important proscenium for European expansion until the 18th century. And also that the Caribbean was a source of migrants in the 20th and 21st centuries. The Caribbean cannot be excluded fundamentally from studies anywhere of the Atlantic world, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And I would say that after the 16th and 17th centuries for the entire world, the Caribbean, after all, was the laboratory for European maritime, colonial, and imperial ventures. And I'll try to say a little of that later on. It is indisputable that until 1850, the Caribbean was the hub for Atlantic commerce. And the impact of the Caribbean can be traced through time and space. And in fact, until the beginning of the 20th century, it was an integral part of any consideration, social, economic, demographic, or political, of this wider world. So let us begin at the beginning. You will remember, the younger ones of you better than I do, that Christopher Columbus, after all, did not set out to discover a new world. He wanted to reach China for purposes of trade. And his failure was one, in a limited sense, of geography. That is, he didn't reach where he thought he would reach, but he reached a very interesting location indeed. And his failure initiated Castilian settlement with the arrival of Nicolas de Ovando as governor of Hispaniola in 1502. And from there, the Spanish spread all over most of the Americas, but spread is not the proper word, because they did not spread like a wave over a shore. In fact, they established numerous enclaves. Between 1502 and 1630, the Spanish built 331 cities in the enclaves they established across the Americas. And most of these early cities were in the Caribbean. Although they were to lose their monopoly, it is important that the Spanish, and to a lesser extent the Portuguese in Brazil, that the Spanish in the Caribbean were establishing settlements for 3 generations before non-Iberian colonists came to the Americas. And so what happens by the 17th century, when the other Europeans are beginning to establish new colonies, is that already in the Caribbean and the Americas, the wider Americans, Europeans had created an entirely new population. And what I mean by a new population is a population that were neither African nor European nor indigenous American. We ought to note that by 1570, more than 60% of the population of the so-called Spanish towns were not Spanish at all, were not African, were not indigenous, but were classified as mestizo. And I think that new mesticized population was the only area in the entire expansion of peoples in the world where this mesticized population had such a dominance. And later, Caribbean immigrants would populate Spanish America and British North America. So in Caribbean studies, we need to emphasize that the history of any country in the Americas cannot be properly understood without including this early American dimension. Also important in this new construction of societies in the Americas by the Europeans was the fact that initially, for the Spanish and all the others, the Europeans tried to reproduce microcosmic forms of European society and cultures overseas. At the same time that they were using these new locales as areas of political innovation or experimentation. And the political experimentation went hand in hand with the development of new concepts of commerce and of the economy. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because basically what we find in the history of the Caribbean and the Americas, and we could say the Atlantic and wider world, is that if in the beginning of the 16th century, the dominant economic concept is that of bullion, that is to say, the value and wealth of a society is determined by how much gold and silver or other precious metals it contained, that was to change by the later 17th century into a sort of commodities. So we went from bullion to a type of commercialism, which was determined by trade. And that type of trade led to the late 18th, early 19th century development of capitalism. Bullion shipped through the Caribbean transformed the economies in most of the rest of the world. And again, I don't have time to develop that. That's a whole lecture in itself, but it's noteworthy that between 1492 and 1650, more than 181 tons of gold and more than 16,000 tons of silver was shipped from the Americas to Europe via the Caribbean. And this bullion allowed Europeans to vastly expand their trade with India and with Asia, as well as to reconstitute the power relationship, the political power relationships within Europe. And if we look at this graphically, and you can see this when you get access to the PowerPoints, that trade involving the Americas and the Caribbean does not have a triangular dimension to it, that it's mainly a series of global bilateral trade connections, North America with the Caribbean with Latin America, and vice versa, the Caribbean with Europe and Europe and the Caribbean with Africa and Africa with the Caribbean with Asia and Asia with the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. And this consideration, I think, is really very important, because when bullion was overtaken in the Atlantic trade construct by commodities, Atlantic, the trade beginning with sugar as the first big commodity, then slaves, and then finally sugar and rum. National wealth was calculated no longer in bullion reserves, where mining, trading, and stealing were the principal ways of getting rich, but by commodity trade. And that was mercantilism. And mercantilism tried to emphasize controls over the forms of trade, whether it was your own imperial trade or your imperial trade and others. And mercantilism lasted, in fact, until the development of capitalism in, I would say, the late 18th century. We could again get into that. And I want to look at this in terms of first of the importance of commodities before I begin to look more at the political impact that the Caribbean had in integrating it in this wider world. We could take tobacco, of course, which was a discovery by the Europeans in the Caribbean. And the importance of this for the Spanish was that the fact that the royal administrators gave themselves a monopoly over tobacco, and the estanco, in fact, was part of Spanish economic life until the 20th century. But tobacco in the Caribbean could not compete with sugar after it entered in the middle, although it was brought with Columbus, but the sugar revolutions are really a story that begin in the middle of the 17th century and goes on even until today, one might say, but certainly until 1870. Voluminous sugar and rum production, mainly in the Caribbean, stimulated workers and made luxury items such as tea and chocolate available to the general public worldwide. And I'm not even beginning to look at the other food crops that are transported along as collateral with sugar and rum. Distilling, for example, employed the second largest labor force in North America during the 18th century. And the ingredients for this huge distillation venture on North America, of course, came from Caribbean sugar producers. And they were producing sugar by generating this wealth outside of the Caribbean, because at that time, there were not the types of economic systems, banking and other forms of capitalism, that allowed some of the profits from these trades to be resident in the Caribbean. That was not to happen until after the Haitian Revolution. In the 19th century, of course, the Caribbean sugar revolutions entered a modern age with the establishment of the central factory and the application of scientific methods to the production of sugar itself. And the sugar industry in the 19th century, beginning with Cuba and then going elsewhere, Puerto Rico, Guianas, Trinidad, etc., South Africa, Australia, differentiated agricultural and industrial aspects of production. But it also introduced chemical applications and the centrifugal process, so that the crystallization of sugar was more feasible than before. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's important to remember that before this introduction of chemical applications, you could lose a whole sugar cane harvest by failing to crystallize the sugar, and therefore you were forced merely to produce molasses and therefore to produce more rum. And that was the reason why the Caribbean became such a marvelous rum producing area. And rum became important, of course, because it was used as a factor in the naval quest to find a solution for controlling scurvy among sailors at sea. So we can now move in the commodity trade that if you have tobacco and you move to sugar and rum, and there are other indigo, there are other commodities, but this is where I think we have to look at human trafficking as a form of commodity commerce. And the transatlantic slave trade as a form of commerce generated wealth in two ways, two unique ways, I would say. The first is that individual slaves had convertible currency value, just like credit cards. So in an age where there are no regular banking systems and trade is a form of barter, individual slaves actually represented money. We're now going through this whole story here at Johns Hopkins University of whether Hopkins, because a census listed him as having slaves, was a slave owner, and did he trade in slaves? But I won't go into that now. The second important observation I want to make is that enslaved persons, that is, enslaved commodities, who were Africans and descendants of Africans, produced goods that could be converted to create wealth. And this commodity commerce of the Caribbean plantation slave societies facilitated in very important ways the evolution of capitalism across the Atlantic world. So if you begin to look at global history after the 16th century, you can begin to see that the stimulus for global political competition in large measure derives in the Caribbean. And the patterns of war, European wars in the Caribbean, were illustrated by the statement emanating from Europe that there could be and should be no peace beyond the line. So now I want to look briefly at the major European and international engagements between 1660, the first of the Dutch Wars, and 1898. And I will look at them in 7 occasions or areas. The first are the Anglo-Dutch Wars of 1652 to 1674. The second, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which was a very important turning point in English, Spanish, and French relationships. The War of Jenkins' Ear of 1739 to 42, not because it was a terribly important war, but you will see that it had some repercussions of long-standing and permanent duration in Atlantic relations. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1783, the War of the American Revolution between 1776 and 1783, the Haitian Revolutionary Wars from 1791 to 1805, and finally the Spanish-American Wars. And I don't want to spend too much time on them, but this is not about the wars, but about the consequence, the generalized consequence that these wars had. In the case of the 3 series of wars that the English and the Dutch fought between 1652 and 1674, what they did was, one, to establish the sugar plantation system as a principal commodity of commerce in the Caribbean after the 1640s, and to lead to the destruction of the Dutch maritime superiority in European affairs, so that the Dutch were relegated after 1674 to trading posts in the Caribbean, in the peripheral islands of the Caribbean and Dutch Guiana. And they were, moreover, became expert middlemen at arranging the marketing and very important in the development of commerce and capitalism through this commerce, and making the sophisticated barter system that could be the foundation of 18th and 19th century capitalism. The Treaty of Utrecht, as you know, was the end of the Wars of Spanish Succession were going on from 1700 to 1713. And what it did was to separate the Spanish Bourbons from the French Bourbons, so that Philip V, acknowledged as King of Spain, renounced French succession and divided those 2 families. Spain surrendered the United Provinces and yielded to Great Britain as a state rather than as companies that did before, the asiento to supply Africans to Spanish America. Louis XIV agreed that French and Spanish monarchies would be permanently separated, so that the Bourbon dynasty ended with the French Revolution but continued in Spain until today. Britain, of course, gained Gibraltar and Minorca for further complicating the relationship, European political power relationships, especially in the Caribbean. But after Utrecht, Britain became the primary European commercial power. It wasn't evident at the time, but it became gradually evident after the 7 Years' War. But before we go to the 7 Years' War, there was this important minor war in the Caribbean from 1739 to 1742 called the War of Jenkins' Ear. A stupid war, all wars are stupid, but this was a little more stupid than most, in which, of course, the British tried to capture Havana and failed, tried to capture Cartagena and failed, tried to capture Panama and failed. But out of this, these failures came, just as you might say, the failure of Christopher Columbus led to the European expansion in the Americas. The failure of these wars of Jenkins' heir led, of course, to the adoption of sugarcane distilled alcohol called rum as a permanent part of the British Navy between 1739 and 1970, when every British sailor was issued a pint of rum a day. And that was not a small volume of alcohol consumption. So it made rum a really important product after that. And as a sort of minor point, that George Washington's brother Lawrence and 4,000 recruits from Virginia served with Admiral Vernon in these 3-year expeditions. Lawrence Washington named his estate in the Potomac Mount Vernon. And of course, I am surprised how few Americans realize that the origin of that name comes from this Caribbean relationship of Lawrence Washington and Admiral Vernon. The 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763 are also very important and are sometimes overlooked in a lot of even military histories about these wars. And what is important is the major reallocation of Caribbean islands, that France would trade Martinique and Guadeloupe for the province of Quebec, all of Eastern Canada, which it thought of less importance than Martinique and Guadeloupe. That France gave Louisiana to Spain because Spain had invested in the war and lost, as the French did. Spain gave Florida to Britain. And the 7 Years' War is a war that really emphasized the supremacy of the English Navy in the Atlantic Ocean and later beyond. But the consequence of that was that these wars bankrupted the English government so that it had to impose taxes on tea and other colonial products. And as you know, this led to the Boston colonists dumping the tea in the Boston harbor, thinking that maybe if the Arabs served tea with salt, British tea with salt water might be an alternative to the tea they were drinking. No, that's a joke, bad joke. So I will move on. But the bankruptcy of that led to the American Revolution. And the American Revolution, of course, is the beginning of imperial disintegration, of European imperial disintegration, because the British eventually lost their North American colonies except for Canada. What is important to us is not the war of North American independence between 1776 and 1783, but the Battle of the Saints in the Caribbean in April 1782 between the French Admiral de Grasse and the English Admiral Rodney. And I am quite surprised, in fact, how often the Battle of the Saints does not feature at all in the American Wars of Independence, as they should. Because if you look at the sequence, and you can review it in the recently released Ken Burns documentary about Benjamin Franklin, in which he fails to explain why it is that the French could be left out of the discussions between England and the North American colonies in 1783, even though the discussions were held in Paris. And to understand that, I think you have to go to the Battle of the Saints, because what the Battle of the Saints in April 1782 did was to destroy the French Navy, which had just assisted the Americans to defeat the English at Yorktown in October 1781. By 1782, by April 1782, the French no longer had their Atlantic Navy. The French, therefore, were not able to capture Jamaica, and the British would not only defeat the French Navy, they would destroy it. And that bankrupted France and led to the calling of the Estates General and, of course, the French Revolution in 1789 and afterwards. So I think this is an integral series of events that must be considered, whether you're talking about French history or English history or American history. It is self-evident that the Caribbean was intimately involved in the wars of the French and Haitian revolutions because of Haiti, of course, grew out of the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And that in 1790, the Caribbean produced more than 90% of sugar traded internationally. And those major producers of those were the French Saint-Domingue and the British West Indies. The Haitian Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, therefore, would have a tremendous impact not only on sugar production, but the world sugar market, because it was the English continental blockade in 1805 that led Napoleon and the French to develop beet sugar, which by 1815 would be sufficient to make every continental country in Europe self-sufficient in sugar and no longer make the sugar market in Europe dependent on sugar imports from the Caribbean. So one has to see the defeat of the French in Saint-Domingue as the beginning of the disintegration of Caribbean slave systems, as well as the transformation of the world sugar market. And the transformation of the world sugar markets may lead to the consideration of the Caribbean in universal political transformations, of which I think one has to begin with the American Revolution, because the American Revolution, of course, was not a true revolution, but it gave the sort of good housekeeping seal of approval to all revolutions afterwards. So let's begin, of course, with these revolutions that transformed the world. Now, I have put 7 of them on the PowerPoint, which you will see, and I should say why I have only said there were only 7 great revolutions, when if you study revolutions, people come up with hundreds of revolutions. Well, I think to understand or differentiate a revolution from any other form of political change, radical or otherwise, one should define what one means as a revolution. I define a revolution, a political revolution, as a social change, as a fundamental change in the social basis of political power. Now, of course, you can say, and should say, that in the USA between 1776 and 1783, there was no fundamental change in the social basis of political power. And I would agree without hesitation. But I would say what the United States did was that it made possible the construction of states, which before was not possible. The states came out of a sort of tradition of dynastic rule. Meanwhile, the United States said the states could be artificially created by contract. The French Revolutions, 1788 to 1815, was a fundamental revolution. What it did was to bring the nation state, or create the nation state and make the nation state a part of change, an indispensable part of change. In the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1917, I would say the social basis of political power moved from the center of the country to the northwest, to the Sonora dynasty. And again, one can go into all sorts of other changes that became fundamental in political practice afterwards. The Russian Revolution between 1917 and 1926 was certainly a fundamental change. And I could have added the Bolivian Revolution. Like the Bolivian Revolution, it had a finite terminal point in 1989. But of course, I'm just looking at when the transformation is taking place. And by 1926, the new state was in operation. And finally, it's the Chinese revolutions. And those are the ones which are not Haitian and not Cuban. So let me look a little at the Haitian Revolution, why they were important. It is true that the American Revolution led to the abolition of slavery in some northern states. And it is true that the French Revolution temporarily abolished slavery in 1794. But the Haitians abolished slavery in 1793, and the French followed suit in 1794, generalizing it for the French Empire. And what the Haitian Revolution did, by 1804, when it's now an independent state, is that it made human rights a fundamental, it made freedom a fundamental human rights within a totally free society. That's a concept that's not generally accepted until the establishment of the United Nations in 1947. And the Haitian Revolution, of course, begins the general disintegration of slave systems everywhere. Now, I will just briefly say for the latter part of the 19th century that Jamaica and Haiti helped Simón Bolívar in his quest for the independence of Spanish America, and that in 1892 actually, Simón José Martí visited Jamaica and collected money, funds for the independence of Cuba, beginning in 1895, although he was to die before the achievement of that. So what we can see then, and this follows, I think, how Gordon Lewis saw the Caribbean, its people and the region, that from Columbus to the present, the Caribbean has been an integral part of world history. In war and in peace, people from the Caribbean have ventured abroad in imperial battles or peaceful pursuits, such as the construction of the Panama Canal, the building of railroads everywhere, the cultivation of sugarcane and bananas in Central America and Cuba, the harvesting of crops in the USA, the reconstruction of Britain in Europe after the World Wars, and supplying professionals everywhere at all times. And that this international involvement is what I think centers the Caribbean in the global histories of our times and before. And in fact, I would conclude by saying that the unavoidable challenge of Caribbean studies, as Gordon K. Lewis saw it, was to make sure that we center the Caribbean in Atlantic and world history, for that is where it was found after 1492, and that is where it should remain. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Thank you very much. And it was worth the wait. In the end, you didn't need the PowerPoints. That is what we call it in Spanish, conferencia magistral. Thank you, maestro. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
And now we want to call on Anthony Mengo, our dear friend Tony, to comment on this conferencia magistral. Tony, thank you very much.
Gracias, Emilio, and thank you, Franklin, for your usual brilliance to which we become quite accustomed. So that was very good. Now, looking at the gray hair on David Lewis, I have to remember that my wife Consuelo and myself used to babysit when David was in pañales, as you say in Spanish, with his siblings. That is how far back my relationship with the family Lewis goes. And it's been a wonderful relationship. Now, Gordon died at age 72. I'm 84. So it humbles me to think of what this man produced in 72 years of life. But I would begin with a question. What brought Gordon K. Lewis, a Welshman, educated already in the college in Wales, master's from Oxford, and finishing his PhD at Harvard, what brought this man to UPR in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico? What was there about that that would bring him here? First of all, you got to realize that he was cut out of the faculty at UCLA during the anti-communist, anti-red hysteria, which is, by the way, returning now to Florida. And Puerto Rico represented something completely different. Puerto Rico represented a freedom of thought, a combination of Puerto Rican, Hispanic, and American thinkers that created a vivacious campus. And I had the great privilege of having received a lesson from Luis Muñoz Marin, from Rexford Tugwell, from Tom Matthews, from Harry Hooting, from a whole cadre, elenco, as you say in Spanish, that was teaching at the University of Puerto Rico. I also had the great privilege of having as the rector of the university, Jaime Benitez, who made it a point to bring people such as Arnold Toynbee, who spent a week there, Martin Luther King before he became so famous, and a whole series of other people. In other words, I can see where Gordon Lewis, given his temperament, given his intellectual and ideological orientation, would have found the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras a marvelous place to settle. And there he stayed. In fact, the first invitation he had, according to what he told me, outside of Puerto Rico, was when I invited him to spend a semester at FIU during the early stages of that state university in Miami. And he enchanted his students like he would always enchant me. I'm sad to say that Gordon Lewis probably will not be invited again, given the atmosphere that we now have there, where even tenure now is up for grabs. So the question is, I think, of the theme of Ortega said, yo soy yo y mis circunstancias. I am me and my circumstances. Gordon Lewis was himself, was always himself, but his circumstances changed. And it's very revealing to do a little project. Take, for instance, Franklin Knight's introduction to his book, The Growth of the Modern West Indies, a marvelous introduction, because what Franklin does is he goes over the literature that appeared, the Elsa Govaya, who was his professor as far as I remember, and that Gordon Lewis always thought was the most prominent of the West Indians teaching at the time. He said that several times. That was 1968, that book. It was reprinted in 2004 with Franklin's introduction. And then go to his Main Currents of Caribbean Thought, which appeared in 1983, reprinted in 2004 with an introduction by yours truly, and try and figure out whether it was that Gordon had changed between 1968 and 1983, or was it the circumstances that were changing? And I would suggest that it was the circumstances. And fundamental in that change of circumstances was the presence of Cuba and Cuban intellectual thought in the Caribbean at the time. Now that has changed substantially now. This is not the Cuba of today, which I myself, for instance, have no interest in visiting. But that was the Cuba back then. And it was an enormous influence, enormous. From Jamaica, if you look at the thought of Michael Manley, to Trinidad, where Eric Williams used to think of him. Gordon, however, also changed. And I would suggest that the Gordon Lewis, who I remember that great English, Bernard Crick, marvelous English political scientist I spent the morning with, telling me, because he was Gordon's roommate at Harvard, that Gordon was more Methodist than Marxist in those days. And he comes with his Fabian thought, although great admiration for a series of English thinkers. And I remember his lectures. In fact, I would tell you a little anecdote. His seminar in political thought had 3 students: myself, a Guyanese student, and a Puerto Rican who slept through every single lecture, because Gordon didn't speak Spanish. Gordon lectured in English. But those lectures were gems of thought, gems of thought. And you are listening to somebody whose thought itself was transformed radically by his acquaintance with Gordon, both in the classroom and later on a personal basis. Gordon begins to change. And the change is evident in a series of moves to which he now begins to argue that the only way to understand the Caribbean is through a Marxist frame of reference. That was new. And if you want to see how he go to a book called Imperialism and Freedom, in which he outlines a Marxist methodology for the study of the Caribbean, which frankly, I didn't think fit his earlier vision. And it leads me to remember something that Franklin said in his introduction, that Gordon, let me get the quote because I thought it was a marvelous quote, that Gordon very often had flights of fancy, and I'm quoting Franklin Knight, flights of fancy. And then he said, he liked the literary flourish, but loathed the social implications. Interesting. Now, what was happening? We all ourselves change with age. The important point, and I would end with this point, Gordon never stopped being the teacher, the actor, the man who had ideas, as distinct from Miguel de Unamuno, who said, understand things before you go recommending things to politicians. Believe that we should recommend things to politicians. Believe that we should intervene. And he always maintained that the so-called objectivity in the study of society is a myth. I am not sure that I fully agree with that. I tend to now, perhaps as a function of age, to believe more with Unamuno that we should study things, let the politicians make their policies. Gordon was not for that. Gordon was for action. He was passionate about that. And one of the great things he did was to imbue Caribbean studies with the sense that the intellectuals of the Caribbean have an obligation to study society in a way that helps the policymakers make the right decisions for these societies. And I would end with seconding Franklin's point that perhaps Gordon was a little too harsh on the Caribbean, in which he thought that they were, because they had not accepted socialism, they were purely tutelary democracies, not real democracies. I disagree. I maintain that the Caribbean, with some exceptions, represents a model of the way democracy ought to work in pluralist societies. Just look at all the elections that are taking place. Look at the way they behave. And societies such as that of the United States, for instance, could take lessons from what the Caribbean has to teach them. And Gordon imbued us with the sense that we would look at this politics. He made one decision, we make our own. And the beautiful thing about him is that he always respected that. And Puerto Rico was the place where that respect was always admired and respected. So I would end by saying it has been a sincere privilege to have known the Lewis family. I knew Sybil from Trinidad, had lunch at the home of the Farrells in Woodbrook. I would end by saying that the Caribbean has benefited from the thought of Gordon Lewis, which people like Franklin Knight brings forth with equal brilliance to newer generations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for your comments. And before I read to you the one question that we have, and I want to thank the audience, which has stayed through the problems, the technological problems. We've maintained an audience of 50 people. So that's very good. That speaks volumes about the speakers. But I had my own experience with Gordon Lewis. I was going to take his lecture when I was a senior. I had already completed all the requirements, and I had some spare time. And I said, I want to hear this man who has written so much and who has so many interesting thoughts. But contrary to you, I do realize that his Spanish was not top-notch. And the reason I was going to audit his class, but I couldn't because everyone asked him to speak in Spanish. And immediately after the first lecture, I realized I was missing half of the depth of what the man had to offer. So I didn't drop out of the class, I just quit going because the 7 Puerto Rican students that were there did not want him to speak in English. I was the only one who did. And my English was not so good, still is not so good, but I knew I was missing something. So I have a question from the audience. Don Rojas has asked Professor Knight, what do you think of the slavery reparation movements in the Caribbean and the USA? He wants your opinion on the reparations movement.
I was hoping nobody would ask that. I think there are 2 dimensions to that. One is the moral dimension, and I support that wholeheartedly. The other is the pragmatic dimension, and I think there are more important things to do, and I would much rather see that we look at things which are more socially based in terms of our societies and more immediate in terms of relevance than this, because this is not something that can be won in generations. And when I look around the Caribbean and the world of today, in the few years or days that I have left for me, I would like to see some amelioration done for the populations of today, other than reparations, which are institutional and all that, in reducing man's inhumanity to man, which is what the whole question of reparations gets in. This is one dimension of man's inhumanity to man. So how do you establish reparations for every occasion in which individuals or collectives are inhumane to their fellow men?
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, and I would simply, on that note, and right at 4 p.m., would like to thank Franklin Knight for a conferencia maestral, maestro. It was worth the wait, it was worth of the trouble. I want to thank Tony Mango for his incisive comment and as well as his personal anecdotes about the family. I want to thank David and the Lewis family for their support, and I want to thank our audience for having steadfastly hold on to what was worth the wait. Thank you very much. Remember 2 things. It will be, the lecture will be, we will edit it a little bit because there were a bunch of comes and goes, but it will be edited on YouTube under the Institute of Caribbean Studies channel. And also remember to go to the GoFundMe and donate for next year's conference. Thank you very much. Un placer. Muchas gracias, maestros. Buenas tardes.